I've spent the last 20 years leading multi-organizational, multicultural teams on 3 continents across various industries. And in that time, I spent my best energy and my deepest attention on developing the leaders around me. In this series, I'm going to offer some thoughts on leadership, taken from reflections on how people have led in different ways at different times through this coronavirus pandemic. Lesson number 3, suspect your narrative. As leaders, we have to be very suspicious of the narratives that live in our heads. There are 3 ways that we can get the story wrong by not being suspicious of the story in our heads. One of them is by misplacing the central narrative for one of the other also important narratives. One of the reasons why lawmakers in the United States and in Great Britain and in Germany and in Italy and here in Spain failed to stop the explosion of this epidemic, of this pandemic, is because they were trying really hard to manage the wrong story. They were working hard to not appear xenophobic, and xenophobia is bad. And they were working very hard not to appear bigoted, and bigotry is bad. And they were working really hard to keep panic down, because panic is bad. But what's worse is an exponentially exploding novel virus with a kill rate near 3%. Now, the kill rate here in Spain is currently 10%, and that is because the healthcare system got overwhelmed. And that is because we didn't button things up and lock stuff down in time. And that is because we got the wrong story in the middle of the plot line. This can easily happen when we have a failure of imagination, especially when it's combined with a proclivity to manage perception. It is, of course, important sometimes to manage perception as leaders. However, the narrative that we must be suspicious of is the one that says it's going to stay the way it always has been. Repeatedly throughout this crisis, at governmental levels, at the global scale, and even at the organizational level, people continued making decisions as though the world was still the world that they thought it was, that it had always been. Failure to imagine reality often occurs when we commit ourselves to the narrative of the status quo. And finally, the narrative in any crisis, the narrative in any success, is not about the leader. I'm so tired of watching the news from the United States. It's either about Trump or about Trump. It's about how Trump did it right or about how Trump did it wrong. This is not a story about President Trump. It has never been a story about President Trump. It has been a story about humanity and nature, and somehow in all of that, God. The leaders who lead the best in situations like this are the ones who get themselves out of the way, and they do not confuse their story with the story of their people. So mistaking an important story for the central story, failing to imagine the story simply because we're committed to the status quo, and losing the plot because we think it's about us. These are 3 narratives that good leaders have to learn to be suspicious of.